themselves barren. Another commentary defined barrenness as the condition of being unable to bear children. In the Bible, the term is also applied figuratively to anything that is unproductive, such as land or a nation. In the Old Testament, barrenness was looked on as a curse or a punishment from God. Unquote. A third author states this concerning barrenness. He says, in the East, it was looked upon as a ground of great reproach, as well as a punishment from God. The reproach attached to barrenness, especially among the Hebrews, was doubtless due to the constant expectation of the Messiah and the hope cherished by every woman that she might be the mother of the promised seed. In order to avoid the disgrace of barrenness, women gave their handmaidens to their husbands, regarding the children born under such circumstances as their own. End of quote. In other words, in the Hebrew culture, the expectation of the Messiah being born was so embraced by the people that every woman wanted to be able to have children because she did not know if she might be the chosen vessel of God to bear the Messiah. And so if a woman was found to be barren, it would be an embarrassment to her, an embarrassment to her family, an embarrassment to her husband. They could not keep the family seed going. And so this was a heavy-duty thing that they were dealing with. It was some real serious business, especially when it's happening with people who have made a public acclamation that God has called them to his service. Humanly speaking, when we hear that someone is called and anointed of God, we expect to see only fruitfulness in that person's life. Amen. I'm a witness of that because I've been a victim of that. Because I have been called by God to the ministry. Because I have been anointed by God to preach his word. Folk expect that as a called, anointed preacher, you should never have any problems. If you really called of God, all your children should be, excellent and perfect. If you called of God, you and your wife should never have any issues. If you called of God, you should never find yourself going through sickness or ailment or any other stuff that us regular people go through. Being called, being appointed, being anointed of God does not eliminate the human experience. And so we find these women who have been called of God and have been publicly acknowledged that they have been called of God, and their husbands who have been called of God, and yet they're having to deal with an issue that in the minds of their culture is seen as a curse or a punishment from God. Most of you are familiar with the story of Abraham being asked by God to sacrifice his only son of his old age. And Abraham was willing to obey God, and for his obedience, it was accounted to him as righteousness, the Bible said. And Abraham was called a friend of God. But it was not an automatic thing in Abraham and Sarah's life for the promise that God had given to come to pass. It took over 25 years for their promise to be realized. And so I say to this congregation, and I say to every person who says they're a believer in God, don't put the man and the woman of God in a space that God has not put them in, whereby you have an expectation in your human thinking that if someone is called of God, they shouldn't have problems. It just ain't so. Amen? So when we see, even in our day and time, pastors and ministers of the gospel going through falls in their lives and sometimes publicly, let's be prayerful for them. Amen? And not critical. Because truth be told, and you know, you got your own issues that you deal with. And you say, yeah, but see, I ain't no Christian. That don't make no difference. You say you saved. You say you filled with the Spirit of God. The same Spirit that saved the preacher is the same Spirit that saved you. So you have just as much accountability as the preacher does. You just don't have the call that the preacher has. Now, let's take a look at what happens to Isaac, the promised son of Abraham and Sarah, after God spares his life through the father not killing him, but yet having a ram in the bush. Let's look at Genesis 25, and let's go to verse 19. Genesis 25 and verse 19. And it says, this is the account of Abraham's son, Isaac. Abraham became the father of Isaac, and Isaac was 40 years old when he married Rebekah, daughter of Bethuel the Aramean from Padan Aram, and sister of Laban the Aramean. Stop there for a moment. So here we have Isaac, who is presumably a 40-year-old virgin. Amen. Because it was not acceptable in their day for a man to be a rolling stone, as we like to call them today. Papa was a rolling stone. Wherever he laid his hat was his home, and when he died, all he left us was alone. It wasn't the way of their culture during that day. So when we look at Isaac here, it doesn't say anything else about him having any other wife before Rebekah. So him marrying Rebekah is his first encounter with a woman in his life. So he's a 40-year-old virgin. Rebekah is probably in her early 20s, and they get married, and they have the same issue that Isaac's parents had. Listen to the next verse. Isaac prayed to the Lord on behalf of his wife because she was barren. The Lord answered his prayer, and his wife Rebekah became pregnant. The babies jostled each other within her, and she said, "Why is this happening to me?" So she went to inquire of the Lord. Stop there for a moment. We don't know yet how long they have been married, but it had to be for some substantial amount of time because they're calling her barren. And if we think about it, just from a common sense perspective, if she didn't get pregnant in the first few months, that would be okay. If she didn't get pregnant in the first couple of years, they probably wouldn't think much of it. And so there had to be some substantial amount of time that has passed in order for them to label her as barren. Amen. So basically, Isaac sees the handwriting on the wall. Isaac is looking at the fact that he could potentially end up like his pops, not having a child